This video is for educational and historical purposes only. It may contain scenes some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
So I'm here with CEO of New Shepard Films and former officer at the United States Air Force, Jim Huggins. Thank you for joining us today. So you've got a lot of great films going on. We have Footprints and we have Forgotten Heroes. I wanted to talk about Forgotten Heroes first, which is a wonderful and impactful story of the Robert Hartsock. How did you come across that? Where did you hear from him?
Well, I came across the notion of the war dogs in Vietnam probably back about 1989 or so. I found I'd come across a documentary called Forgotten Heroes, America's or War Dogs, America's Forgotten Heroes, something along those lines. And it starred Martin Sheen, and it was about the military working dogs in Vietnam. It was a very powerful story, very emotional, and told a story that essentially 10,000 American lives were saved as a result of the effort of 4,000 military working dogs and their handlers. Mm-hmm. None of the dogs came home. Mm. It was an absolutely tragic story. The majority of them were German Shepherd. I had German Shepherds all my life. I absolutely love that particular breed. So I learned the story of the dogs, but it was a few years later, early 90s, where I learned about Staff Sergeant Robert Hartsock, and as the only military working dog handler to have ever received the Medal of Honor in the history of the United States. And I learned that through a story, if I recall correctly, is through the Vietnam Dog Handlers Association, or VDHA. And I thought, that people need to know about that. People need to know about these dogs, but they really need to know about Bob Hartsock. It just in the back of my mind, I said, one day I'm going to find a way to tell that story. Well, I was in the military at the time. I wasn't a filmmaker. So that just sat there for a very, very long time. But I learned about it in the late 80s, early 90s, and I just planted that seed. It wasn't until we started making Footprints that I had already decided Forgotten Heroes was going to be our next film. Right. I was going to get that story out one way or the other. I don't care what it took. And that just became my driving force, not just to get Footprints out, but just to keep going with New Shepard Films.
Yeah, and I had no idea dogs were in Vietnam. So watching this, I was like, oh, wow. And then now hearing that 4,000 of them didn't make it home, it is very heartbreaking.
It is.
And was that the first war that they started introducing dogs?
No, as a matter of fact, as far as the United States is concerned, we actually started back in World War I. If you look at Mike Lemish is without a doubt the foremost authority on military working dogs, I think, on the planet. He is a historian, he is an author, and he's written a number of books. In fact, Forgotten Heroes, he was involved in working with us on the historical documentation and introducing us to some of the handlers from that era. His book, Forever Forward, Canine Operations in Vietnam, is probably the definitive work on the dogs in Vietnam. But he's also has worked and chronicled the history of these dogs. So they first introduced in World War I, but they're pretty big. They got pretty big in World War II. And then again in Korea. But in those cases, like for example, World War II, it was like dogs for defense. These were dogs that the military was able to acquire from citizens who would volunteer, the family pet to go serve in the military. In many instances, these dogs after the war were offered back to their home. In some cases, they were accepted. In some cases, they didn't want them back because they had gone through military training, and the handlers took them. Either way, the dogs came home. Vietnam was the only time that's happened where they did not. They were abandoned in country. The reasons, as you can see in Forgotten Heroes in the documentary, the reasons were numerous, but they were pretty bogus at the time, and still are, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I'm really surprised that they didn't take them back, because everyone knows the bond that a handler and a dog can have, let alone just a person and their animal. So to leave them after all their hard work.
Yeah. I think you used exactly the right word, bonds. The bond between the handler and the dogs, which is an element of the film that we did that I really wanted to explore. What does that bond look like between the handler and the dog? in many instances, the handlers had to be pulled by other servicemen off of the kennels as they were being dragged to the helicopters to get out of country because they had to leave the dogs there.
Oh, okay.
It was tragic.
Mhm.
It didn't need to happen, and unfortunately, it's a black eye as far as I'm concerned. To be honest with you, I'm extremely proud of my military service. I've got over 30 years with the U.S. Air Force and various components. This is the only time I've not been proud to wear the uniform.
And so this, even if the handler chose, like, listen, this dog has a home, I will take it, they still said no.
They refused to. The theory was that the dog would bring back to the United States, would bring back diseases, would be overly aggressive, wouldn't be able to adopt into civilian life, all of which was just absolutely not true. I mean, we see that today with the dogs that come back that are retired. They come back through Lackland Air Force Base. Military working dogs start at Lackland, they end at Lackland. Doesn't matter what branch, they're all there in San Antonio, Texas, and they're available to be adopted by the public.
Definitely heartbreaking because they did so much, you know, to help us out, as you see throughout this film. And one thing that you talked about in Forgotten Heroes, is the dog's job would be to signal to the handler and everyone behind if there's a trap, if there's a sniper, or if something's off. I'm wondering what kind of did the dog look like? Was there a different look or a sound, or maybe a paw up for different codes, or how did they, you know, figure out what it meant?
That's a great question, because we had several different types of military working dogs over there. Bob Hartsock and his dog Duke, they were a scout team. So Duke would be out in front of Bob, and there would be another military member right behind Bob. So Bob Hartsock's job was to focus on Duke, okay, look after his dog and read the dog's body language, basically to interpret what threats there may be. The guy behind Sergeant Hartsock here, the guy behind Bob, his job was to protect the handler. Mm-hmm. And they were leading the platoon going through, or the squad going through the jungles or whatever, in search of the enemy. We also had what are called mine and tunnel dogs. These were dogs that went down into the tunnels after the enemy. Very, very tough work. Those were, a lot of times, those were Dobermans that went in there. We had sentry dogs. They were the ones that were used mainly by the Air Force for perimeter protection and detection around the base. In almost all cases, there were silent alerts, although, and that's true for the scout dogs. The other areas of work, they could bark and things like that to sound an alert, but the scout dogs particularly were trained for what are called silent alerts. But in the jungles, the dog would stop. They, depending on how they're trained and what they found, they may sit. They're constantly looking around. If you notice German Shepherds, they have two very large ears up here, right?
Yeah, very pointy.
Very, and they're very big. And what, you know, you watch those ears, and when they lock forward, wherever they're focused and wherever the dog's sight is, you can pretty well bet that's where the enemy is. You may never see them, and you may not hear them, and you may not smell them, but the dog does. The dog senses them. And it's one of those things where the handler has to interpret what the dog is saying. That's where that bond comes in. And as somebody who has tremendous benefit from a service dog trained the same way, I can tell you, he shows me and communicates to me my surroundings. He keeps me what we call situationally aware of things I don't even know are there. I don't hear them. And 99.9% of the time, he's right on target. And it's the same way in Vietnam. One of the things that when I was interviewing a number of handlers for the documentary film, one of the things that you would do is when the ears lock, the eyes look, that's where you aimed your M16. I mean, you just use those as your sights, and that's where you aim your weapon. They're very, very good. They detected both from sound and they detected from scent. That's one of the ways that they detected tripwires and other booby traps, because they could smell them long before we would.
So once, you know, the ears perked up and, you know, the handler's able to interpret, okay, there is a sniper in front of us. what is the next step? Can they just start shooting, or is it like kind of go back and alert everybody, or what's the next step in that? And then also for a booby trap too.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. There's a lot of pieces in there. So let me unpack that. The chances of identifying a sniper is not very high, simply because the sniper's 1,000 yards or so away,
Right.
Or 500 yards away. So what they're looking for is to engage into another unit or another squad of the enemy. Now, it could be a couple of guys that are out on a reconnaissance, but for the most part, you're looking for a group of individuals. And when it all depends on the mission that you're on, what the current rules of engagement might be as to whether or not you get to shoot first and ask questions later, that sort of thing. But typically, if the dog alerted and you have had engagement with the enemy and it's expected, you have a really good idea, you know, that's the enemy, then at that point, the platoon leader has a decision as to how he wants to engage. The handler and the dog up front would almost never engage first. They're the most valuable asset for the unit. And so what they would do is get down, and the rest of the unit would be around them, first of all, to protect them, and second of all, to verify what have we got out there and what tactics do we need to employ. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that if the dog had detected, it's not detecting a human being or a human target out there in the woods, the dog is detecting a booby trap, say a tripwire between some trees, or maybe some punji sticks just buried underneath the ground, or what have you. The dog's going to alert differently for something like that. The dog may have been trained to sit. The dog may have been trained to lay down and stare, but there's a different series of reactions to that threat. At that point, everybody stops. The platoon leader is advised as what the problem is. They inch forward till they find it. Then they make a determination: do we go around it? Do we blow it in place? Do we disarm it? You know, what do we do with it? So usually the platoon leader had a lot of options available in terms of how to deal with the threat that the dog detected. The dog's going to tell you, we got a problem here, it's in that direction, and it is either going to be human or it's some sort of device. At that point, then you have to make a decision how best to handle that.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, just like humans, dogs get tired too. So, yeah, I mean, you have these dogs on night watch, and then they're working during the day. When did they ever, you know, for lack of a better word, clock out? And then also, so one of them was tired and low on energy. How do you work around that, but also still work forward with the time crunch that you're on?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, when a unit deployed out in the field and they asked for a scout dog team, then whoever's up next in the rotation with that scout dog platoon would join that unit, and then they would go out. So the dog and a handler weren't part of the unit that's going out conducting operations. They're just attached to them for that purpose. So that's item one. Item two, the question is, how many days are they going out? Are they going out for 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, 2 weeks? Because the handler is the one carrying all the food and water for the dog and himself and his ammunition. So you can bet that the handler is carrying at least twice the amount of weight of anybody else in the unit. Mm-hmm. He's got to carry it all. I really respect these guys, because if anybody's going to get tired first, it's going to be a handler. Right. As far as the dog working, it really depends a lot on the situations. There are instances, regrettably, where, you know, the dog was exhausted and succumbed to heat exhaustion before anybody really realized how far gone the dog might be, how hard the dogs were, including the handler. And nobody knows that dog better than the handler does. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that did happen. There are times where, you know, the dog may get dehydrated just like a human would. So it's really up to the handler to make that decision, to make that call as to how long and how hard they can work the dog. The dog needs to take a break, and the handler says so. The platoon leader needs to listen to that and let the unit take a break. As far as nighttime is concerned, for example, if they weren't on nighttime operations, if they were on daytime ops, the dog would generally rest when the handler rested. So whatever schedule the handler was on, that's what the dog was on as well. I remember speaking with one handler, Roger Forbes, who was Bob Hartsock's best friend and just an absolute super guy himself. He said it wouldn't be unusual that, you know, prior to a mission, you know you just came off one, you've got some time before you're going to go back out again. You've got to get your dog bulked back up again, because your dog might lose 10 or 15 pounds on a 5-day mission.
Right.
Because they've worked so hard and they've sweated so much and so forth, just like a human being. They lose a lot of weight, they've got to be bulked back up again. There were a lot of factors that went into that back in Vietnam. Those are still factors even today in Iraq, Afghanistan, or wherever we may have these guys. But the missions and the way they're conducted are done a lot differently. And one of the other things too is, and this little piece of trivia, the handler always is one rank lower than the dog.
Oh.
So if the dog is a staff sergeant, the handler is a sergeant, because it's a problem. It's a UCMJ action if they don't take care of a higher ranking member of the military. So
yeah,
it's a very interesting way they look at it today to ensure that the canine is cared for. The other thing that's very important is that the units, like in this case with Bob Hartsock and Roger Forbes and some of the other guys, part of the 44th IPSD, or Infantry Platoon Scout Dog Division, they had their own vet tech with them. And that vet tech, in this case, Lamar Smith was their vet tech. And again, just another absolutely spectacular individual as a person. These guys knew as much about canine care as perhaps a veterinarian might. So I apologize to any of the veterinarians out there, but these guys got so good, particularly with emergency care, trauma care, that they were very gifted. We were very fortunate to be able to track down and find the veterinarian for the 25th Infantry Division that actually took care of Bob's dog. So I can tell you firsthand, these dogs got premier treatment as long as they got back in from the field. The field was very rough and very tough for these guys, not just the dogs, but the humans too.
Did you volunteer to be a handler, or were you selected to be one? And then how were you paired with what dog?
You volunteered to be a handler. This was considered to be the most dangerous job in Vietnam. You had the shortest life expectancy, and it was the most dangerous. And the dog actually had the shortest life expectancy of any living creature for the United States. There was a bounty on their heads, in fact. This became immediately obvious with how effective they were against the North Vietnamese and basically the enemy. The enemy determines how valuable your resources are by how much or how badly they want to deprive you of your assets. So in this case, they quickly learned that the dogs were the most valuable assets that the U.S. military had, and they put a bounty on their head. If you brought back, the scalp or the ears of a dog, the tattooed ear, that is, that showed what dog it was. If you brought back those remains, having killed the dog, you received a nice reward from the North Vietnamese, depending on where you were, determine how much money you were paid for that. Some things that folks don't like to hear, but there was also a bounty on the handler if you brought back their scalp.
I'm wondering, do you know if the North Vietnamese ever got, I would say, like, inspired to use dogs themselves? Were they like, okay, this is something that we need to start utilizing? Or were they just like, let's just kill the American dogs?
That's a good question. The answer, as far as I know, is no, they were never inspired to use them. One of the things that in warfare that you always need to look at is the context of the war and understand the society. And in this case, dogs are considered a delicacy over there. They're not considered a useful animal like we do. And a dog for companionship is virtually unheard of at that time. So to my knowledge, they were never inspired to use them. I've never heard of dogs being used against American forces, certainly not in Southeast Asia.
And just to recap, so how were they paired with their handlers?
Yes. By luck, basically. It's whichever handler is available, whichever dog's available, both in training and in country. So in training, it would be whichever dog might be available in the kennels, that's the one you get. Lieutenant Larry Hughes relates an interesting story about the dog he was paired with in training, and it's would not have been his first choice as a dog, but they wound up getting along, and he's still alive, so that's good.
Yeah.
But in country, your chances of going into battle with the dog that you trained with at Fort Benning is near zero. You were more likely taking over for another handler who is rotating back to the States. They put in their time, but the dog stays.
Mhm.
And so you come in and take over for their dog. That that still happens today. But back then it could be a challenge because that dog may not want to perform for anybody else. That dog may have bonded with that other soldier or their previous handler, because remember, they're sharing life and death, and these dogs are not stupid. They understand that. They get it.
Yeah.
They know that human at the other end of the leash is very significant. So sometimes it was difficult for them to bond with another handler and still perform at the same level of excellence that they had been. That's one challenge. Other side of the coin is sometimes it worked just fine. You know, the dog understands basically this is my job. The handler that came in was able to establish the bond, and a lot of this is up to the human. It's not just up to the dog. This goes two ways.
Right.
Apollo's my ninth one, and I get that concept of the bond very, very well now.
Yes.
A lot better than I did with number 1, 2, or 3.
Mhm.
And it's one where that's something you have to work at, and it takes time. Some lieutenant or platoon leaders were better at giving their handlers time to develop that bond than others. So there's a certain amount of randomness here that was entered in, but everybody had the same mission. They understood what the dogs were there for, what the handlers were there for. That was a unit, and they understood how it needed to work.
If the dog started lacking in performance because their owner that they had bonded with or handler, either finished their term or they got reassigned somewhere, what would happen to that dog? You just get put down, or would they? What?
That's a good question. Okay, so the dog may stop performing or may stop working for a couple of reasons. Number one is, maybe they were so tightly bonded with their handler that it just didn't work out with anybody else anymore. That's one reason. The other reason is that dogs, like humans, get PTSD. They get to the point where I don't want to hear bombs going off anymore. I don't want to be shot at anymore. I don't want, trekking through the jungle. I'm tired of this. And that can happen. So the dog can get to a point where they can't work anymore for a variety of reasons. In those cases, it would not be unusual for the dog to be put down in that scenario. Today, that absolutely does not happen, but that dog comes home. But for the most part back then, that would be one where they would have to euthanize the dog.
So you were in the Air Force. Did you ever work with a dog? And what can dogs bring to the Air Force sector of the military?
I did not work. I was not I was not a dog handler, and I did not work with the dogs in service. But I was the benefactor of their work. I worked in certain facilities that required sentry dogs, and these dogs, I'll tell you what, if there was a German Shepherd on the line, I slept soundly. It didn't bother me at all. I knew I was in good shape because nobody's going to get past one of those guys. I just have that level of confidence. So there's the indirect impact that these dogs have for our forces. A lot of times our troops understand that dog's on patrol, I'm in good shape. That's a mindset that you just can't get anywhere else. And that's very empowering to forces in the field. So the Air Force uses these guys for a lot of security purposes because we're not a ground-based force, okay? It's when dogs learn how to fly planes, that'll be impressive. But for right now, they are ground forces. So they provide security around facilities, for one thing. They provide physical security and working with our air police to provide security to installations, say like at the gate or whatever. Bomb detection, bomb sniffing, and we've used them for that for a long time. We do still today, where they're not only checking the cars that come on base, but they're also out on the flight line checking the planes to make sure they've not been sabotaged, for example. They provide security, physical perimeter security for the planes. So some aircraft have what we call a nuclear mission. They carry nuclear weapons instead of conventional. And every once in a while, those weapons may be available, or they're flying missions or what have you. Those dogs are always around to help add another layer of protection for those forces. The other thing that they can do, again, is for drug work. We do search our bases, and we do try to keep tabs on illegal substances that come in and may be posing a hazard to our forces.
Mm-hmm. So the dogs could sniff out a problem with an aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
That's incredible. What is one thing that you wish more people knew about working with dogs?
I think from a military perspective, I think our citizens are getting a better idea of the value of these dogs and what they provide to our services. And that's not just from Forgotten Heroes in our film, but there have been other shows that have, and other features out there that have talked about them. And it's not so much a hidden aspect anymore. People understand more. So I think that that's a big thing. The more people know and understand, the better. I have spoken with a number of people associated with the VA, particularly the VA healthcare system, that did not realize these dogs are available for adoption when they come back from the field. There is a very strict process that the Air Force goes through to make sure that it's a good match, but these dogs are available. One thing that has been huge on the military side, kind of crossing over into service, is the PTSD epidemic that we have with our forces, and the ability for dogs to help in that scenario, to help provide the care necessary for a veteran who is suffering from PTSD. It's amazing how they detect an anxiety or a panic attack and are able to calm that down very, very quickly. Those dogs are they're expensive, and they're few and far between, but they're becoming more and more available because they're finding they can use dogs that come back from the field, and it's a great hand in glove match with a veteran and also a veteran canine. Mm-hmm. On the civilian side, service dogs will be better understood and accepted as true service dogs. And I mean this, whether it's airlines or whether it's restaurants or whatever. I rarely have a problem with Apollo out in public. Anybody going, what? The biggest problem I have is people wanting to come up and pet him, and you're not supposed to do that with a service. But the other thing, though, is that, but access to civilian travel is really the big thing, such as air travel. And the reason that's becoming an issue is there are so many people that will hang a vest that says service dog on their pet. Yeah. We call them a pet in a vest. They're not a service dog. They're not providing a true service as defined by the ADA. And the ADA ties businesses' hands in terms of what they can do about it. You can't ask me what my dog does. You can ask me to demonstrate it, but you can't talk to me about my disabilities. Why do you have a service dog? You can't ask that question legally, and you should be able to. I'm happy to provide his credentials. I'm happy to provide the letters that show the disabilities that I have that he is trained to help me with. But what hurts me and hurts my dog is when you bring your pet into an environment and your pet hasn't been through the training, your pet doesn't have the discipline, and your pet is actually a potential problem for mine because they don't have that. I don't know what level of training, and I, restaurants can't do anything about it, even though it's immediately obvious this is not a service dog. This dog is not working. You're spending too much time petting it and playing with it. That's not a service dog. So, sorry, that's my soapbox. At a personal level, the medical side of this is don't do a pet in a vest. These guys are real. They work hard, and there's a reason for their service. The military side is these dogs also deserve a second home. It's available. People should take advantage of it if they can.
Real quick on the military side, would they ever pair a dog with PTSD, with a veteran with PTSD?
Yes.
Is that more? Oh, okay. So that can bring comfort and less conflict.
It works with both of them. They both, because there's something about the way that your brain and the chemistry works when you're having a panic attack or having some of these other issues of depression and so forth. The dog senses that. And the dog, and in the case of like Apollo, I mean, the PTSD that I deal with, the moment he detects that, he does exactly what a PTSD dog is supposed to do. He comes over and leans against me, because what that does is center me and go, hey, wait a minute, I'm still here.
Right.
And that will bring you back like that. Dogs that suffer from PTSD, and again, this is one where it's not just because they have that diagnosis. You have to study the dog and make sure you understand what the issues are to make sure it's a good pairing. But the dog has also got that, and they need that. And all that does is help both individuals, both lives.
Right.
A lot of times we as humans are not able to adequately describe that and define that and put a nice box around it, because we ourselves don't understand it. What we see is the results.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's like you turn on a light or you turn off a light. You may not know how the light bulb's working, but you see the light. It's an effect.
So the last question I have for Forgotten Heroes is, how long did it take you to create this film, and what was the process like?
Long. Forgotten Heroes actually started out as a film, as a feature film, and we still want to do the feature film. The challenge with a feature film is obviously dollars, being able to raise the funds and shoot the film. So we have the script. We know what we want to do. It's a matter of raising the money and actually being able to film it. There's a lot of the film that exists back in the past in Vietnam. So you've got sets that are time specific. You can't just go anywhere. So it's an expensive film to go shoot. But I wanted to get the story out about the handlers and the dogs, at least about Bob Hartsock specifically. And I wanted to focus on that. So it evolved from a feature film that's on the shelf to, okay, what can we do as a documentary to tell people about it? So if we get enough interest from the documentary side, now we have a way maybe to fund a full feature film that really tells the story firsthand, as opposed to through a series of interviews.
Right.
So we had to shift gears, and then, as you said, do the research and find everybody. There was a period where we were not able to approach the family, and I'll leave it at that. There were some issues that had arisen that, not with us, but just with the family's desire, we don't want to talk about this type deal. I got a message on Facebook from somebody that said, thank you for wanting to tell Bobby's story. I've been praying that somebody would do this for years. And we're going, who is this person? Who is this? So we do a little research. We find out, first of all, that was a real person. They really did know Bobby. We were able to get in touch with the family at that point. They made the introductions that we needed that allowed the doors to be open. And at that point, it was the floodgates. So we were able to contact every surviving member of the 44th IPSD, including their platoon leader, Lieutenant Hughes, who actually put Bob in for his Medal of Honor. We found that most of them, virtually all of them, had no idea he had received the Medal of Honor. They didn't know it.
Wow.
Lieutenant Hughes had no idea what had happened when he put him in for it. He never got any feedback. This is one of those that the more we dug into it, the stranger it appeared. When we finally found the pictures that had been taken by the Army of the presentation that took place at the White House, we're seeing things in the pictures. It's like, why do we have a 4-star general here, for example? That guy should be in country. There were a lot of things that were very strange. So I go to the Nixon library to go research this further. There was no indication that the Medal of Honor had ever been conferred. And only the president does that. He awards the medal in the name of the Congress to the recipient. Richard Nixon's the most recorded president in modern history, okay? There wasn't anything I could find in terms of a presentation. I found one entry in his daily library that would correspond roughly to when the family would have been in Washington, D.C., that said presentation, in the yellow room or whatever it may have been. So things began to get very weird as we did our research. And it became very evident that Bob Hartsock not only received the Medal of Honor for saving his lieutenant, but that his action saved his entire unit, saved every dog on the base, actually saved the base, and as a result, altered the course of the Vietnam War. Working through the research, some of the people we contacted associated with the various presidential libraries were going, can we have a copy of your material? And I'm going, no, you can't. You already told me it didn't exist. I'm not going to play that game. So one of the best libraries that was so helpful to us was the Ronald Reagan Library, actually, because there was material there that pointed backwards in time, and then the LBJ files pointed forward, and we could figure out what was actually going on in country and that sort of thing. But that allowed us to pull a lot of pieces together to actually tell the documentary about Bob and Duke. So we've got a lot of background information now that I would love to put in a feature film. Just kind of, it's sitting there waiting. We haven't done anything with it. It's not going to get the shredder or anything like that. But there's a lot of good information here.
Did you ever encounter any like U.S. officials who were like, we are not authorizing you to share this story just because if you're saying that Nixon didn't want that out?
Let's put it like this. I was very careful where I pulled sources from and pulled information from. Being in a fairly classified environment myself, we use what's called dual phenomenology. We look for two different sources saying the same thing. And that's what we made sure of in every part of this. So there was no way that any government entity could come back and say, you can't release this or anything like that. The other thing is, and this is the really good part, the time limitations for classifications had already expired. You know, they're only good for a certain number of decades, and this occurred back in the late 60s. So we were good in that part. What I was surprised at was the lack of cooperation from certain libraries. Some libraries were great to work with. As I said, the Reagan Library was probably the best one to work with. They were so helpful.
Thanks so much for joining us on Valorous TV with this very special interview with director and producer of Forgotten Heroes, Jim Huggins. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and click the link below to watch the entire documentary of Robert Hartsock, Forgotten Heroes, right here on Valorous TV.